Have you ever wanted to just disappear, to leave your old life behind and become someone completely new? That's exactly what Serafina Sterling was doing on a rainy Tuesday night. But she wasn't just anyone. Serafina Sterling was the only daughter of billionaire tech mogul Alistair Sterling. And right now, she was trapped. She stood in her penthouse, a glass cage high above the city. Below, lights twinkled, but all she felt was the weight of the gilded prison her life had become. On her desk lay the final straw, a contract for a merger marriage to a man she barely knew, a business deal dressed up as a wedding. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "It's for the good of the family, Serafina. It's your duty." But her heart screamed one word, "Run," and so she did. With a single backpack containing cash, a fake ID she'd secretly obtained under the name Sarah Jones, and the plainest clothes she owned, she slipped out a service entrance. She left behind her credit cards, her designer dresses, and the identity of Serafina Sterling forever. She bought a one-way bus ticket to a place she'd only seen in pictures, a small coastal town named Seabrook Haven. It was the polar opposite of her world, simple, quiet, and anonymous. The bus ride felt like crossing into another universe. The skyscrapers shrank into pine trees, and the frantic city energy softened into a calm, salty breeze. When she stepped off the bus in Seabrook Haven, the air smelled of ocean and fresh rain. She was terrified, but for the first time in years, she was free. Her first mission was to find a job and a place to stay. She saw a help wanted sign in the window of a charming, slightly weathered cafe called the Driftwood Cafe. Taking a deep breath, she walked in. A little bell chimed above the door. The place was warm and cozy, filled with the rich smell of coffee and baked goods. A man stood behind the counter, his back to her, wiping down an espresso machine. He had broad shoulders and tousled, sun-lightened brown hair. "Be with you in a sec," he called out, his voice warm and friendly. When he turned around, Sarah's breath caught slightly. He had the kindest eyes she'd ever seen, a warm, steady hazel, and a smile that felt genuine. He looked at her not with the calculating gaze she was used to, but with open curiosity. "Welcome to the Driftwood Cafe," he said. "What can I get for you?" I'm here about the job," Sarah said, her voice quieter than she intended. "The sign in the window." His smile widened. "Oh, great. I'm Kai, the owner." He extended a hand and she shook it. His grip was firm, his hands rough from work. "And you are?" This was it. The first test of her new identity. "My name is Sarah," she said, hoping her voice didn't shake. "Sarah Jones." "Well, Sarah Jones," Kai said, leaning on the counter. "Ever worked in a cafe before?" Sarah's mind went blank. The closest she'd ever come to making coffee was summoning a barista to her office. "No," she admitted honestly, "but I'm a fast learner, and I really need this job." Kai studied her for a moment, his head tilted. He seemed to be looking for something in her face. Sarah braced for rejection. "Honesty," he said finally. "I like that. The pay isn't much, but I can teach you the ropes. Can you start tomorrow?" Relief washed over her so powerfully she felt dizzy. Yes, I can. Thank you so much." As she left the cafe, a genuine smile touched her lips for the first time in months. She had a job. She had a name. She had a chance. But as she walked down the main street of the sleepy town, she couldn't shake the feeling of Kai's gaze. It was as if he could see right through her new name and her simple clothes, straight to the terrified heiress hiding underneath. What would you do if you had to start your life over with nothing? Do you think Sarah can really leave her old world behind? And what about Kai? Does he suspect something already? This story is just getting started, and you won't believe what happens next. Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe to follow Sarah's journey in Seabrook Haven. Now let's get back to the story. Little did Sarah know that in this quiet town, she was about to find everything she'd ever been missing, and her past was closer than she thought. The sun hadn't even fully risen over Seabrook Haven when Sarah stood outside the Driftwood Cafe the next morning. Her stomach was a tight knot of nerves. This wasn't just a new job. It was the first day of her new life. She took a deep breath of the salty air and pushed the door open. The cafe was quiet, filled with the soft pre-dawn light. Kai was already there, humming softly as he sat up behind the counter. He looked up and gave her that easy, genuine smile. "You're early," he noted, sounding pleased. "That's a good start." "I didn't want to be late," Sarah said, her voice still laced with a city-born urgency that felt out of place in the calm of the cafe. Kai handed her a dark green apron. "First rule of the driftwood," he said. "Coffee for the barista comes first." For the next 2 hours, Kai was a patient, if somewhat amused, teacher. Sarah, who had never so much as boiled an egg without assistance, was a disaster. She overfilled the espresso portafilter, sending gritty coffee grounds everywhere. She steamed milk into a frothy, overflowing mess. When she tried to create a simple heart in the foam, it looked more like a lopsided blob. Kai watched her struggle with the espresso machine, a small smile playing on his lips. "Let me guess," he said, leaning against the counter. "Your last job was less hands-on?" Sarah froze, a lie already forming on her lips. But looking into his kind, open face, she found she didn't want to lie. "Not completely. Let's just say I spent more time in meetings than making anything," she said, which was technically true. He didn't press further. Instead, he came around the counter and stood behind her, gently guiding her hands on the machine. "It's about pressure, not force," he said, his voice calm in her ear. His presence was steadying, and for a flickering moment the panic subsided. When the first customers trickled in, the real test began. Sarah fumbled with the cash register, her fingers clumsy. She mixed up orders, writing "no foam" on a cappuccino and "extra hot" on an iced coffee. An elderly regular named Mr. Henderson watched her with a twinkle in his eye after she gave him back too much change. "You're not from around here, are you, dear?" he asked, not unkindly. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. "Is it that obvious?" "Just a bit," he chuckled, pushing the extra money back toward her. "We all start somewhere." The morning rush was a blur of mistakes and mild chaos, but Kai never lost his patience. He quietly fixed her errors, stepped in with a charming apology when a customer grew impatient, and never once made her feel like a failure. During a brief lull, as Sarah was wiping down tables, she overheard 2 local women talking at the counter. "Who's the new girl, Kai?" one asked, her voice carrying. "She's very polished." Sarah's body went rigid, the cloth freezing in her hand. "Her name's Sarah," Kai replied, his voice easy and warm. "And she's doing just fine." "We all have to learn." The simple defense, offered without hesitation, sent a wave of unexpected warmth through her. No one had ever stood up for her so unassumingly before. People usually defended the idea of her, the heiress, not the person. At the end of her shift, exhausted but strangely exhilarated, Kai handed her a perfect latte. "You survived," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "And you only set off the fire alarm once. That's a new record." Sarah laughed, a real unguarded sound she hadn't heard from herself in years. "I'm sorry about, well, everything." "Don't be," he said. "You kept trying. That's what matters around here." He paused, looking at her thoughtfully. "Look, I know you're new in town. A few of us are getting together for a bonfire on the beach tonight. You should come. It's a good way to meet people, an invitation, a simple, normal social invitation. In her old life, parties were lavish, calculated affairs. This was different. This was real. "I'd like that," she said, a shy smile forming. That evening, as she walked toward the sound of laughter and the glow of firelight on the beach, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. The salty air, the sound of the waves, the promise of a simple connection. It was all so foreign, yet it felt more like home than her penthouse ever had. She saw Kai standing by the fire, silhouetted against the orange flames and the dark ocean. He saw her, raised a hand in greeting, and started walking toward her. But just as he did, a sleek black car, entirely out of place in Seabrook Haven, slowed to a crawl on the coastal road above the beach. Its dark-tinted windows were like eyes, scanning the scene. Sarah's blood ran cold. It was the same model of car her father's security team used. She stood frozen on the sand, caught between the warm, welcoming fire and the cold, familiar shadow of her past. The new life she had just begun was already in danger. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. The sleek black car moved slowly, like a predator scanning its territory. For a terrifying second, she was ready to run, to vanish into the darkness and never look back. But then the car continued down the coastal road, its taillights disappearing around a bend. It was just a car. A coincidence. It had to be. "Hey, you made it!" Kai's voice cut through her panic. He was standing a few feet away, holding 2 drinks, his face lit by the warm glow of the bonfire. He looked so solid, so real, so completely separate from the world she'd fled. Sarah forced a smile, hoping her fear didn't show. "I did," she said, her voice a little shaky. He handed her a drink. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Everything okay?" "Just a long day," she said, taking the cup. "I'm still getting used to things." He nodded, his gaze understanding. "It takes time. Come on, let me introduce you to everyone." For the next hour, Sarah was swept into the easy rhythm of the small gathering. She met Ilara, the owner of the local bookstore, who had a mischievous glint in her eye. Ben, a friendly fisherman with a booming laugh, and a handful of other townspeople who welcomed her without question. They talked about the weather, the best fishing spots, and the upcoming town festival. No one asked about her past. No one cared about her pedigree. They simply accepted Sarah Jones, the new girl at the cafe. It was liberating. At one point, she found herself sitting on a log next to Kai, watching the flames dance against the starry sky. "So," he said, his voice soft, "what brought you to Seabrook Haven?" Most people don't just stumble upon this place. This was the question she'd been dreading. She looked out at the dark ocean, the waves a steady, calming rhythm. "I needed a change," she said, which was the truest thing she could say. "A real one. My old life was all about what I was supposed to be, not who I actually was." Kai was quiet for a moment, studying her profile. "I get that," he said finally. "This town is full of people running from something or towards something. You fit right in." His words were a balm to her soul. He didn't pry. He just understood. Later, as the fire died down to embers, Ilara produced a guitar, and someone started singing a soft folk melody. The group joined in, their voices harmonizing with the sound of the waves. Sarah didn't know the words, but she sat there, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, listening. She felt a sense of peace she hadn't known was possible. This was what she had been missing. Not the money, not the luxury, but this. Genuine connection, simplicity, belonging. As people began to say their goodbyes, Kai walked her back toward the main street. The town was quiet, bathed in moonlight. "Thank you for inviting me," Sarah said, meaning it more than he could possibly know. "I haven't felt that light in a long time." "Any time, Sarah Jones," he said, his smile visible in the dim light. "You're one of us now." He walked her to the door of the small, rented room she'd found above the post office. It was a far cry from her penthouse, but it was hers. "See you tomorrow at the cafe," he asked. "Wouldn't miss it," she replied. She watched him walk away until he disappeared around a corner. Leaning against her door, she sighed, a happy, contented sound. Maybe, just maybe, she could really do this. Maybe she could be Sarah Jones forever. But as she turned the key in the lock, a glint of something on the ground caught her eye. Nestled against her doormat was a small, smooth black stone. It was unusual, perfectly round. She picked it up, curious. And that's when she saw it. A single word had been painted on it in tiny, precise white letters. "Run." The peace of the evening shattered. The fear came crashing back, colder and sharper than before. The black car hadn't been a coincidence. Someone had found her. They were here, and they were sending her a message. The world seemed to tilt. Sarah stared at the small painted stone in her hand, the single word screaming at her in the silent night. Run. Her first instinct was to do just that, to grab her backpack and disappear into the darkness. But her feet felt rooted to the spot. She had just found a place where she felt a flicker of happiness, a sense of belonging. Was she really supposed to leave it all behind because of a stone? Her mind raced. Who left it? Her father's security team wouldn't be so cryptic. They would have simply taken her. A rival company? A journalist? The possibilities swirled, each one more terrifying than the last. Clutching the stone, she hurried inside, locking the door behind her and pushing a chair under the knob. Her heart pounded as she peered out the window into the quiet, moonlit street. Nothing moved. Seabrook Haven was asleep. The next morning, she arrived at the Driftwood Cafe looking exhausted. The cheerful bell above the door felt like a mockery. Kai took one look at her, and his smile faded. "Rough night?" he asked, his voice full of concern. Sarah forced a nod, avoiding his gaze. "Just didn't sleep well." She was a nervous wreck all morning, jumping at every sudden noise, her eyes constantly darting to the window. She burned 2 batches of pastries and spilled an entire pitcher of milk. During a quiet moment, as she was refilling sugar jars, her hands trembled so badly she dropped the container, sending a cascade of white crystals across the floor. "Whoa, easy there," Kai said, appearing beside her with a brush and dustpan. He didn't scold her. He just started quietly cleaning up the mess. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears of frustration and fear. "Hey," he said softly, stopping his work to look up at her. "Whatever it is, you don't have to face it alone. This town looks after its own." His kindness was almost too much to bear. She wanted to tell him everything: the gilded cage, the arranged marriage, the terrifying warning. But the words stuck in her throat. How could he ever understand? How could she drag his simple, honest world into her complicated, dangerous one? Later that afternoon, an elderly woman named Mrs. Gable came in, a regular known for her sharp eyes and gentle heart. As Sarah handed her her usual tea, the woman's gaze fell on Sarah's wrist, where she had nervously tied the painted stone into the drawstring of her apron. "What a curious stone." "Dear," Mrs. Gable said, her eyes twinkling. "A warning or a wish?" Sarah's blood ran cold. What do you mean?" "Oh, around here, painted stones are an old tradition," the woman explained, taking a slow sip of her tea. "During stormy seasons, the fishermen's wives would paint them and leave them for each other. Sometimes for comfort, sometimes for caution." She gave Sarah a knowing look. "It depends on the message and who's sending it." The information swirled in Sarah's mind. A local tradition? Did that mean the threat was from someone in Seabrook Haven? The thought was somehow more frightening than the idea of a corporate spy from the city. The danger was no longer a faceless entity. It was here, walking the same streets, smiling the same friendly smiles. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of paranoia. Every customer seemed suspicious. Every glance felt like a threat. At the end of the day, as she was untying her apron, the stone fell out and clattered onto the counter. Kai picked it up before she could stop him. He turned it over in his hand, his brow furrowed as he read the word. His expression grew serious. "Sarah," he said, his voice low. "Where did you get this?" Panic seized her. I found it," she stammered, "outside my door last night." He looked from the stone to her face, his kind eyes now filled with a protective intensity she hadn't seen before. "This isn't a joke," he said. "This is a serious warning in these parts. Has anyone been bothering you? Have you seen anything strange?" He was worried about her, not about the secret she might be hiding. The realization broke down the last of her defenses. Tears finally welled in her eyes. "There was a black car," she whispered, the confession feeling both terrifying and relieving. "Last night on the coastal road. It slowed down near the bonfire." Kai's jaw tightened. He placed the stone on the counter and put a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Okay," he said, his voice firm and calm. "You're not alone in this, Sarah. I promise you that." In that moment, as she looked into his determined face, Sarah realized the battle was no longer just about running from her past. It was about fighting for her future. And for the first time, she wasn't fighting alone. Kai's hand on her shoulder felt like an anchor in a stormy sea. For the first time since finding the stone, Sarah didn't feel completely alone. "Listen to me," Kai said, his voice low and steady. "You're safe here, but from now on, you don't walk home alone. I'll drive you, or Ben from the fish market will. We look out for each other in Seabrook. Tears finally escaped, tracing clean paths through the flower dust on her cheeks. She wasn't crying from fear anymore, but from an overwhelming sense of relief. This was what community felt like. This was what it meant to have someone in your corner. "Thank you, Kai," she whispered. True to his word, he drove her home that evening, and the next, and the next. He didn't press her for more information, but his watchful presence was a constant reassurance. He started walking her to her door, his eyes scanning the quiet street before he left. Sarah, in turn, began to relax. The fear that had been a cold knot in her stomach began to loosen. She threw herself into her work at the cafe, her latte art improving from blobs to recognizable hearts. She learned the names of the fishermen who came in at dawn and the shopkeepers who stopped by for their afternoon break. She was becoming Sarah Jones, for real. One evening, after a particularly busy day, Kai drove her home as usual. But instead of dropping her off, he killed the engine and looked at her, his expression serious. "I know you don't want to talk about your past, Sarah," he began, "and that's okay, but I need you to be careful. I've been asking around quietly. A few people have mentioned seeing a stranger in town, a man in a suit, asking questions. He was particularly interested in the new girl working at the cafe." The fear came rushing back, cold and sharp. What did he look like? Tall, dark hair, sharp-looking, dressed like he was from the city. Lucas, her father's most trusted, most relentless security chief. He wasn't just a faceless threat in a car anymore. He had a name and a face, and he was here in her sanctuary. "He's found me," she breathed, her hands trembling in her lap. "He hasn't taken you yet," Kai said firmly, his hand covering hers. It was warm and rough, and it stilled her shaking. "And he won't. This is my town. We protect our own." He reached into his glove compartment and pulled out a small, old-fashioned brass whistle on a leather cord. "My grandfather gave this to me," he said, placing it in her palm. "It's loud enough to be heard from one end of this town to the other. You keep this with you. If you see that man, if you feel scared, you blow it. I'll come running, so will half the town." Sarah looked down at the whistle, then up at Kai's determined face. He wasn't just being kind. He was making a stand. For her. The next day, she wore the whistle under her shirt, the cool metal a constant comforting weight against her skin. She felt braver with it there, like she had a secret weapon. It was a Saturday, and the town was bustling with a weekend farmer's market. The Driftwood Cafe was packed. Sarah was at the register, taking orders with a smile that was starting to feel real when the bell above the door chimed, and there he was. Lucas stood in the doorway, his sharp eyes scanning the room. He was impeccably dressed in a dark suit, a stark contrast to the casual, sun-kissed patrons of the cafe. His gaze swept over the crowd and then locked directly onto her. Time seemed to slow down. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Her fingers instinctively closed around the whistle beneath her blouse. Lucas began to walk toward the counter, his steps measured and sure. People instinctively moved out of his way, sensing the intensity he carried like a weapon. He stopped directly in front of her. "Serafina," he said, his voice a low, cold blade that sliced through the cheerful noise of the cafe. "Your father is very disappointed. It's time to come home." Sarah stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it, the moment she had been dreading, but then she felt a presence beside her. Kai had come out from behind the espresso machine, wiping his hands on a towel. He didn't say a word. He just stood next to her, a solid, unyielding wall of support, and then something remarkable happened. Mr. Henderson, the elderly regular, stood up from his table. Ben the fisherman put down his coffee and folded his arms. Ilara from the bookstore stepped closer. They didn't know who Lucas was. They didn't know Sarah's secret, but they saw one of their own being confronted by a stranger, and that was all they needed to see. Lucas's eyes flickered around the room, taking in the silent, united front. His confident expression wavered just for a second. Sarah took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the whistle. She wasn't Seraphina Sterling, the runaway heiress, in that moment. She was Sarah Jones, the barista, and this was her town. The cheerful chatter in the Driftwood Cafe had died completely. Every eye was fixed on the tense scene at the counter. Lucas, a man carved from city steel, stood on one side. On the other stood Sarah, with Kai and the entire town of Seabrook Haven silently at her back. Lucas's cold gaze swept over the faces of the fishermen, shopkeepers and retirees who had formed a quiet, human wall around Sarah. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his features. This was a variable he hadn't accounted for. "Seraphina," he repeated, his voice losing some of its sharp edge. "This foolishness has gone on long enough. Come quietly. There's no need for a scene." Sarah felt Kai's hand gently press against the small of her back. It was all the encouragement she needed. She straightened her shoulders, meeting Lucas's gaze directly. "My name," she said, her voice clear and steady, ringing in the silent cafe, "is Sarah." A soft murmur of approval rippled through the room. Mr. Henderson gave a firm nod. Lucas's jaw tightened. He was a man used to giving orders and having them obeyed without question. This defiance, this public rejection, was something he didn't know how to handle. "You can't stay here," he insisted, though his confidence was clearly shaken. "This fantasy, it's not your life." "This is more my life than the one you're trying to drag me back to," Sarah fired back, her courage growing with every word. "I'm not a business asset to be merged. I'm a person, and I'm not going with you." Lucas took a half step forward, a subtle, intimidating move. But in that same instant, Ben the fisherman took a louder, heavier step forward, his arms crossed over his broad chest. Elara moved to stand shoulder to shoulder with Sarah. The silent message was clear: try it. The standoff lasted only a few more seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Lucas was outnumbered and out of his element. He could see the fierce, protective loyalty in the eyes of these people. He was a wolf who had stumbled into a pasture guarded by a unified herd. Finally, he gave a curt, frustrated nod. "This isn't over, Seraphina," he said. His voice a low, threatening whisper meant only for her. "Your father will not let this go." He turned on his heel and walked out of the cafe, the bell chiming his exit. The sleek black car was waiting at the curb. He got in, and it pulled away, disappearing down the coastal road. For a moment, no one moved. Then a collective sigh of relief filled the room. Kai turned to Sarah, his eyes full of a fierce, proud light. "You were incredible," he whispered. The rest of the day was a blur of quiet celebration. Customers patted Sarah on the shoulder, offered words of encouragement, and made a point of telling her she belonged. She was no longer just the new girl. She was one of them, a fighter they had protected and who had, in turn, stood her ground. That evening, as the sun set over the ocean, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Kai walked with Sarah along the beach. The sound of the waves was a gentle, calming rhythm. "You heard him," Sarah said softly, her earlier bravery giving way to a lingering anxiety. "He said it wasn't over. My father, he doesn't accept failure. He'll send someone else, or come himself." Kai stopped walking and turned to face her, taking both of her hands in his. "Let him," he said, his voice unwavering. "He'll have to go through me. Through all of us. You have a home here, Sarah, a real one. Don't let fear take that away from you now." Tears welled in her eyes again, but this time they were tears of hope. She looked at Kai, at this man who had given her a job, defended her, and now stood ready to fight her battles with her. She looked out at the town, at the warm, glowing windows of the homes and shops that had become her sanctuary. He was right. She had spent her life running, from expectations, from duty, from a gilded cage. But she wasn't running anymore. For the first time, she was ready to stand and fight for the life she had chosen, for the person she was becoming. She squeezed his hands, a new determination settling in her heart. "Okay," she said, "I'm staying." She was no longer a runaway. She was a defender of her own destiny, and her army was the entire wonderful town of Seabrook Haven. The days after Lucas's departure were filled with a new, quiet energy. Sarah wasn't just living in Seabrook Haven anymore. She was part of its heartbeat. She no longer jumped at every strange sound, but the brass whistle remained a comforting weight under her shirt, a symbol of the promise this town had made her. Her hands, once clumsy, now moved with practiced ease around the espresso machine. She knew that Mr. Henderson took his tea with 1 sugar and that Ben liked an extra shot in his afternoon coffee. She was Sarah Jones, barista, and the title felt more real than Heiress ever had. Her relationship with Kai had deepened into something unspoken but solid. They worked side by side in a comfortable rhythm, their conversations flowing from cafe logistics to childhood dreams. He taught her how to identify constellations over the ocean, and she, carefully omitting her past, told him about her love for art and her longing for a life that felt authentic. One evening, as they were closing up the cafe, Kai didn't immediately start wiping down the tables. Instead, he leaned against the counter, watching her with a thoughtful expression. "The Seabrook Summer Festival is next week," he said. "It's the biggest event of the year for the town." Sarah smiled, locking the cash register. "I've heard. Ilara said there's a parade and a dance on the pier." "There is," Kai said, his voice softening. "And I was wondering if you'd go with me." It wasn't just a question about a town event. It was in his eyes, in the slight nervousness in his posture. It was a real date. The first one that wasn't born from a pretense or a practice run. Sarah's heart fluttered. "I'd love to," she said, her smile widening. The night of the festival, the town was transformed. Strings of lights crisscrossed the main street. Music filled the air, and the scent of saltwater mingled with cotton candy and grilled food. Sarah wore a simple, flowing dress she'd bought at a local boutique, and when Kai saw her, his breath caught. "You look," he began, then simply shook his head, a look of pure admiration in his eyes. "Wow!" They walked through the festival hand in hand, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. They played carnival games. Kai won her a small stuffed seagull by knocking over milk bottles. They shared a bag of warm donuts, and they danced under the stars on the wooden pier, the music blending with the sound of the waves. For a few perfect hours, the shadow of her past vanished. She was just a woman, on a date with a man she was falling for, in a town that felt like home. As the fireworks began to explode over the ocean, painting the night sky in brilliant colors, Kai led her to a quieter spot at the end of the pier. The booms echoed over the water, the lights reflecting in his eyes. "Sarah," he said, his voice barely a whisper against the noise. "I know there are things you haven't told me, and that's okay. I'm not in love with your past. I'm in love with the woman you are here. The one who isn't afraid to get flour on her nose, who stands up for herself, and who makes the best lopsided latte art I've ever seen." Sarah's breath hitched. He'd said it. "I'm in love with you." He reached into his pocket, and for a heart-stopping second, she thought he was going to pull out a ring, but it was a small, smooth white stone. He pressed it into her palm. On it, he had painted a single, simple word in dark blue letters: "Stay." Tears filled her eyes, blurring the fireworks above. This wasn't a demand or a contract. It was a request from the heart, a promise. "Kai, she began, her voice thick with emotion. But before she could say more, a familiar, chilling voice cut through the celebratory noise. A touching scene. They both spun around. Standing at the entrance to the pier, his silhouette stark against the festival lights, was Alistair Sterling. Sarah's father. He wasn't accompanied by security. He was alone, his expression a cold mask of disappointment and fury. The fantasy shattered. The real world, in the form of her powerful, relentless father, had found its way to the end of the pier. "The fireworks are over, Serafina," he said, his voice cutting through the night. "It's time to end this little experiment and come home." The world seemed to stop. The cheerful sounds of the festival, the laughter, the music, the distant crackle of fading fireworks faded into a dull roar in Sarah's ears. All she could see was her father's cold, disappointed face. All she could feel was Kai's hand tightening protectively around hers. "Father," Sarah breathed. the word feeling foreign on her tongue. Alistair Sterling ignored Kai completely, his gaze locked on his daughter. You've had your rebellion, Serafina. You've embarrassed this family long enough. The merger with the Vance family is still on the table, but only if you return tonight and fulfill your duty. Kai took a half step forward, placing himself slightly in front of Sarah. She's not going anywhere with you, he said, his voice low but firm, carrying over the sound of the waves. For the first time, Alistair's eyes flickered to Kai, regarding him with utter disdain. And you are? He asked, his tone implying Kai was something he'd scraped off his shoe. I'm the man who loves your daughter, Kai stated without a hint of fear. And I'm the one asking you to leave her alone. Alistair let out a short, humorless laugh. Love? You think this fantasy built on lies has anything to do with love? She's been playing house with you, boy. She is a Sterling. Her life, her duty, is elsewhere. His words were meant to wound, to shatter the bond between them. Sarah felt Kai stiffen beside her. She knew what her father was doing, trying to isolate her, to make her feel alone again. But she wasn't the same person who had run away. She gently pulled her hand from Kai's and stepped forward, standing not behind him, but beside him. She faced her father, her back straight, her chin held high. You're right, father, she said, her voice clear and strong, carrying a newfound authority. I'm a Sterling, and that means I have a mind of my own, a heart of my own. I am not a business asset to be merged. I am not a doll to be placed on a shelf. My duty is to myself, to live a life that is true and honest. Alistair's composure finally cracked. Do you have any idea what you're throwing away? The wealth, the power, the legacy? I know exactly what I'm leaving behind, Sarah replied, her gaze unwavering. A gilded cage, and I'm choosing this. She gestured to the town, to the pier, to Kai. I'm choosing a life that I built myself. I'm choosing freedom. I'm choosing love. She looked at Kai, her eyes full of certainty. I'm staying. The defiance in her eyes, the absolute conviction in her voice, finally silenced her father. He looked at the daughter he thought he owned and saw a woman he no longer recognized, a woman of strength and purpose. He saw the united front they presented, and he knew he had lost. With a final, searing look of bitter defeat, Alistair Sterling turned and walked away, disappearing back into the crowd, a lonely, powerful figure swallowed by the very community he despised. The moment he was gone, the tension shattered. Sarah let out a shaky breath, her shoulders slumping. Kai immediately wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. You were amazing, he whispered into her hair. I was terrified, she confessed, her voice muffled against his chest. But you did it, he said, pulling back to look at her. You chose your life. You chose us. As they walked back through the festival hand in hand, people smiled and waved. They didn't know the specifics of the battle that had just been won on their pier, but they could see the result. Sarah and Kai, together, radiant and free. Weeks turned into months. The threat of her past never fully disappeared, but it no longer controlled her. She was Sarah Jones, co-owner of the Driftwood Cafe, partner to Kai, and a beloved member of Seabrook Haven. One evening, as they sat on their spot on the pier watching the sunset, Kai turned to her. You know, he said, that first day you walked into the cafe with your city shoes and nervous eyes, I had no idea you'd turn my whole world upside down. Sarah smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. Best disaster I ever caused. He laughed, a warm, happy sound that blended with the waves. I have something for you. He handed her a small, familiar box. She opened it to find the white stay stone, but now it was set on a simple, beautiful silver chain, a reminder, he said softly, of the bravest choice you ever made. As he fastened it around her neck, Sarah knew the runaway was gone forever. In her place was a woman who was finally, completely home. And that's the story of how a runaway heiress found her true home in a small coastal town. What did you think of Sarah's journey? Was she right to choose love and freedom over wealth and duty? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more heartwarming stories. Thank you for watching.